We've entered an era where open source is now a status symbol. There used to be a day where open source really meant something. It was a badge of honor that when you saw it, you had good feelings about it. It signaled transparency, it signaled open collaboration, allowing you to maximize not only the feeling of safety, but also the potential of the app. It allowed for community-driven development, software freedom. And I believe open source has become a performative act. Many open source projects still abide by this. However, in parallel, it has increasingly devolved into a marketing tactic, status symbol, and an engagement farm. We see the heavy hitters like Elon Musk coming out and saying, hey guys, we're working on this, but hold your horses. We're gonna open source it. Don't worry about it. Like you have pressure to do so. And so let's get into why open source has shifted. Open source has really become the tech equivalent of filming yourself giving money to a homeless person, which is to say it's less about the actual positive aspects and more about what it comes to you in terms of its perception. We've all seen these absolute clowns on YouTube that are purely driven by likes, follows, etc., giving their sweet hard-earned $5 to a homeless guy so that way they can earn back about $5,000 on the equivalence of engagement they get from it. And open source has really turned into this where really people go out of their way to mention it at every corner. In this day and age, you'll be hard pressed to find a case where they don't call out open source either right away or within a sentence. And a lot of the times it's like the most slopified app that nobody actually needs. But we need this quick engagement farm. We need to find some way to show people we care. Right? I'm a developer too, guys. Look at me. The quintessential Gary Tan POV. So a major benefit of open source has always been, hey, well, it allows open contributions, right? We can get contributions in the realm of security, general improvements, which is often a good thing. Some of the best people when it comes to contributions are the people that actually use the software. And open source opens a gate where people who use your piece of software actually get to make contributions to it, at least in theory. The reality is quite different, right? The definition of open source is being stretched. Source available, which is where companies proudly announce their open source initiatives, but what you actually get is a read-only repo that can never be touched or maintained beyond the engagement farm running dry. We'll release this open source software, yes we will, but guess what? As soon as these likes and these views and these retweets start slowing down, so does our meaningful contributions to this software. And in some cases, they won't make any at the onset. They'll release this, they'll dump this into the fucking dumpster of GitHub, and they'll call it a day. They'll say, hey, here you go, have fun. And so despite the theoretical optimal case where it's a user that actually uses the app that could make meaningful contributions to the app, this is hardly ever the case. The maintainer might make it seem like it's all about open collaboration, but then they'll roll up their window and say, hey, we're not looking at PRs anymore. There's too much AI slop. And to be honest, I don't blame them. Right? We are seeing, especially today, that really is the reality of open source. We're in an era where open source repos are receiving hundreds, if not thousands, of half-assed PRs that are generated in minutes with AI and are being touted as high key impact additions. Right? When you've got a million freaking PRs and every one of them is claiming to be amazing and integral, you then have to devise plans of reducing this effort. And you could spend hours and hours trying to mitigate this, right? One option of doing this would be to have curated creators or curated contributors, have people with reputation. You can kind of bar who gets to contribute, but then you're just really going against the idea of open source at that point. It stops becoming open source as an open collaboration and really just a way for you to pick and choose what goes in. Is that really open source? And so I don't blame the open source maintainers here, I really don't. But I think we lose this selling point of open source in today's age because we have to limit who gets to contribute to make it a realistic project. Even worse is the disregard of the repository and the reality, which is that the open source code base is rarely what runs in production. There's a false misconception going around that whatever we see in the code is what's being used by the company. That is rarely the case. They tack on a lot of things into the end product. And so while you might go to a repo like Buzz from Block and see everything here right in front of you, but nothing stops them in their production version of the app adding a few additions there. And in some cases, they will be fundamentally different, future locked, and even telemetrized in the production release. And so unless you build and host the binary yourself, you really have zero guarantee that the code you see is actually what you're getting in their production version. And so for self-hosted apps, this isn't an issue. And in fact, it's a benefit. But with this, we lose the argument of it being a benefit to the user in terms of its safety and trust. The trust goes as far as who's hosting it. And if you're not hosting this exact binary, then the trust is gone. You cannot assure yourself that these major companies that are posting these open source projects are not doing something under the hood in their hosted version. There are some common open source arguments of why one might want to open source, and I think a lot of these are starting to fall, especially with how AI has changed the landscape. When you can deploy a bunch of agents and have it scan the code base and point out specific vulnerabilities, you're in a whole different environment here. So this argument of, hey, we have more eyes on the code, certainly this is a good thing, right? More eyes, more opportunity to find bugs. In theory, this is absolutely true. But unfortunately, it disregards reality. The reality is the public consists of good lazy actors and bad proactive actors. The guys that you are worried about are freaking 10x engineers that are dedicating hours and hours and hours of scanning your code base and looking for any exploit. Whereas the good actor is the one taking a siesta and just using your app willingly and sparingly, right? If you look at the profile of the person that likes you and the person that hates you, you'll find that the person that hates you actually spends a lot more time caring than the person that likes you. Because it actually takes a lot of effort to dislike somebody. You have to actively search for reasons to dislike them. And if you go to a YouTube comment section, and you probably will see that in this comment section, you'll see that the most vocal ones are the ones that hate you, right? They'll go into depth about how your argument's terrible. They'll have 4 to 5 paragraphs talking about how you don't know anything. They'll find tiny holes in your argument that you never made and argue against it. Whereas the person that likes you is just gonna have one comment that says, hey, good video. In the case of code, it's the same thing. The person that hates you and wants to see you fail is going to look for any vulnerability in that code base, best believe. The person that likes you is just going to use it and maybe contribute when they want something added, but are rarely going to seek out things that are damning to the system. That's just a reality of open source, and that's a reality of how humans act. And so malicious actors are often the most motivated readers of open source code, actively searching for 0 days to exploit before a patch is even drafted, whereas the good actors are few and far between, and they seemingly are exclusive to roles that require A, being in love with software development, where you have to realize this right here is not as common as you think. I would venture to guess less than 1% of the people that code and are waking up every day thinking about it, where every part of their day they're thinking about software development in some way. These are the people that are the good actors that you want on your team and will actually benefit from having more eyes, but are very few and far between. And what you end up getting is the negative actor. And not only that, they also need to have a strong attachment to the tool itself. You have to really care about using something like it's your pride and joy to where you want to see it succeed just because you use it every single day. If I only use something once, I'm much less likely to make a meaningful contribution because I don't even have good opinions on what's good for it, and also realize how much time goes into investing into finding these loopholes and these issues. You need to have a strong investment in the product. And so if I don't really care about what I'm using, while on top of that being in love with software development, you're not getting any of my assistance. And so while on the surface, more eyes seems better, in reality, you never end up with that. Not to say that closed source is a better alternative. I think closed source has its own pitfalls, but at least with that, you're not freaking promoting your code base on the billboard. With open source, your code is right out there to be seen by everybody. At least with closed source, there's a bit of a layer that's guarding it that makes it a little bit harder to crack. Not saying it's net positive to be closed source, but definitely you are running a risk there. And I think this argument of having more eyes being beneficial is never the case with open source. There are way too many bad proactive actors and too many good lazy actors. Number 2, trust and comfort. This is an overstated claim. The assumption here is that users feel safer when using the software if the source code is public. And I think the argument for this is, well, hey, if we have everything out in the open, certainly there's nothing to hide. And so we get to be happy in knowing that, hey, everything's there. Certainly we're good to go, right? Most people are not going to audit a 100,000 line vibe code base. They're just not. They're going to take the open source software and go along with the idea of, hey, it must be okay if it's open. They're just going to go along with this thought in their head. They're going to feel great, but they're not actually going to go in and look at it. And there will be times where code goes unlooked at for a long period of time, despite it being open source, because it becomes harder and harder than ever with the vibe coded apps to actually understand and fully connect with the code base in a way that lets you find these vulnerabilities. In a closed source system, the idea is, hey, well, if there's bad code here, we don't get to see it. And so we're outside the door, knock on it saying, hey, we want to change this. But with open source, yes, it's opened, But the vastness of the code base doesn't give you an immediate access to understand what is a problem in that code base. Hopefully, over time you get enough good actors that figure this stuff out and identify them. But again, as we were saying before, open source code base is rarely what they use in production. So unless you're running this locally, this benefit really doesn't exist. And even if it does, it is not bulletproof. You cannot be sure, unless you're spending time reading 100,000 lines of code, that it is perfectly kosher. Number 3, owning the baseline. Now this is a benefit that is actually still somewhat present, but not fully, especially with the advent of AI tools. Right? This used to be a genuine benefit. However, in the age of AI, open sourcing code is basically providing a blueprint for someone else to clone, rebrand, and monetize. You can just yoink your freaking open source project. Effectively, you're slaving away, spending hours and hours maintaining the code base. Guy comes in, tells the AI, hey, copy this, make it distinct enough to pass in court. And guess what? They end up with an output that's pretty good. Now, obviously there is some way around this. You can argue for copyleft. I'm not saying you have no course when it comes to AI copied code. However, while the license can afford you an opportunity in court, this is no free battle. By the time someone has stolen your work and created a user base with the large financial gains, in parallel, they have also likely contributed to their law litigation team. And so you find yourself in a position where the guy that stole and you might have some money to throw out this issue, but this guy that stole, guess what? He knew the day was going to come. And he was prepared for it. He got all these user bases, all this money, and he's ready to go. And he's going to fight tooth and nail to make sure he can continue his business. Maybe you'll win. Maybe eventually, after a long fought battle, you might get the copyleft claim. But is it really worth it? Is it really worth it for an open source free piece of software? Usually not. Smaller people are not going to bother here. They're just going to secede and accept their fate. Hey, this guy stole my work. That sucks. I'll make sure people know about it. But what am I going to do? I'm not going to spend a bunch of time and money arguing for it. It's an unfortunate position where, yes, it is beneficial, right? In a good context, somebody copies and attributes. And we see this. Like, don't get me wrong, there are projects out there today that abide by this. And that's why this is labeled as okay, because there are cases where it can work and it is good. But oftentimes what ends up happening, you bear the maintenance burden while somebody else harvests its value. Right, we're seeing a case here with Theo where somebody straight up copied his entire T3 code and then changed the license attribution. And in someone like his position, right, he can make this vocal and known, and this benefits you a lot. You and I probably don't have this power to just send out a tweet and it gets seen by hundreds of thousands of people. We don't get that justification right away. And so we would have to go into court and spend $1 bajillion on court fees just so we can possibly come out with a victory that may not even have been worth it at the end of the day. Now, there are cases where open source does make sense, and I'm not going to list them all here, right? Open source isn't inherently bad. It's just been haphazardly applied to software where it brings zero value. Right, there are cases like infrastructure, package managers, places where it's high security is of an importance. Even in this case, right, you can argue there are downsides to being open source, and I'm sure you could even argue downsides here. But I think there are absolutely cases where open source makes sense. Don't think I'm just downing all open source projects. I'm mainly focusing on the performative ones, right? And that's this third bullet here: quiet goodwill. Projects released simply to share a solved technical problem without demanding an audience or demanding engagement in return. This still exists today and typically involves a discovery of awesome. This is open source. When's the last time you felt this? It feels like today this is becoming rarer and rarer because we get open source shoved down our throats before we even know what it is. We're seeing a rise in these open source repos, and we're seeing a rise of leading with open source as your selling point before you even get into what the heck it is. And so this quiet goodwill is becoming rarer and rarer. And so you don't often get to feel this feeling of, hey, I can't believe this is open source, because you already heard about that before you even use the damn app. Flavor of the month apps. We do not need these to be freaking open source. We don't. Standard consumer apps, SaaS tools, and niche products rarely benefit from open source. Certainly there's cases where it does, but for the most part, it is performative, and it is not necessary at all, right? You're probably gonna end up in one of these camps where it's read-only source and you're just using this for engagement. There's no benefit to it being open source at all. Maybe you're not in that bucket, but for the most part, that's what I've been seeing. And so the defense for open sourcing standard consumer products usually defaults to grandstanding, but it's for the greater good of humanity, right? We're doing a service. We're God's gift to earth with our open source project. This is what it feels like when somebody announces their open source AI slop front end. That's just a straight up wrapper, because absolutely we had to have that be open source, right? But dude, it is literally just software. Unless you're Meta or Microsoft, you're not going to be able to maintain that long term, right? Let's say you are a good open source person and you treat it as open source was intended, which is an open collaboration, and not at the incentive of engagement or selling points, you're not going to be able to sustain yourself long enough to keep that up. Because to do open source requires you to spend a lot of time and a lot of effort maintaining it. Where a common way to exploit the open source community is to treat committers as employees using open source as a way to generate free labor. Imagine the hours and hours slaving away at a massive corporation's code base that some people have done. And it is free labor for them. You know, they may have free open source, right? Meta has React, Microsoft has a bunch of open source projects. While that is true, right, VS Code is free, there is some underlying things they're trying to sell through these systems. And typically it's very, very subtle. It's to the point where really it's just an ear whisper. Microsoft's not making money directly off VS Code, but it gives them a platform to constantly steer you in a direction of using one of their own products. And so this is not a purely goodwill endeavor for them. We all know the famous video here. I don't even need to say the words that they say in this video, and you know what they're saying. This is a common trend of companies like Microsoft, where they really whisper in your ear, like, hey devs, we love you. You're the greatest thing ever. They just want you to be on their side, so that way you will contribute and benefit them while also buying their products. You, as a small, lonely user, to reach the point where an app is beyond what a layman vibe coder can achieve, you've likely dedicated hundreds, if not thousands of hours, and by then, without a carrot at the end of the stick, which is oftentimes money, right? I think everyone kind of operates with money in mind in some case, you may eventually succeed into the millions of failed GitHub projects. If you don't find a way to monetize that open source project that you have, the clock is ticking. It'll end eventually. And in some cases, you'll do that and it still will end eventually, right? I think we all heard about Tailwind. They had plenty of ways that they tried to make income and make it work, but it's just, it ends up not working at the end. You pretty much have to go against the idea of open source to earn an actual meaningful income that lets you benefit from the open source. And these flavor of the month apps are not doing that. And so what happens is you end up with millions of projects that just fail and die out. And typically they are these standard consumer apps, SaaS tools, and niche products that are just using the open source name as a marketing coin. And so to conclude here, I think open source has really started to become a performative act. I think there are good open source projects, but the average line of what is good and what is bad is shifting more and more to the bad side. Pre-AI, I felt like it was more on the good side, but we started to see it being used as a marketing ploy. However, it was a lot harder to contribute to these in a way that really the investment wasn't good. But now it's like you can vibe code an open source app and sell it that day, and you get the aura of being open source with the very little contributions that were made. I believe this bar is going more and more to the left, and it'll continue to go more and more to the left. And I think part of this is just inevitable. I think it's the realities of AI tools, where it's like, dude, if you have 1,000 PRs, what are you gonna do? This is all you can do is restrict your code base to the point where it's not truly open source anymore, where it goes against the initiatives of open source, at least from the standard definition of it. And I believe that if a project relies on shouting this claim at the rooftops, making sure to mention that it's open source around every corner. We even see this with companies like Meta, who frequently shout from the rooftops about how LLAMA is open source. And there are portions of it that are open, for sure, but it is very loosely referring to the idea of open source. There's a lot of restrictions that come with LLAMA. And so here we can see from Open Source Initiative, LLAMA 3.x is still not open source by any stretch of the imagination. And despite that, Meta keeps on falsely promoting LLAMA as open source. Because it's easy, right? It's a good marketing term. When you put open source on anything, it's instantly regarded as a positive, and people won't even look into it oftentimes. They'll just assume, hey, it's open source, guys, we're good to go. Let's go on in. And while something like Android is open source, you'd have to be an absolute knobhead to think that they're using Android raw like this in any phone. Samsung, who else is there? HTC, Nothing Phone, whoever the hell you can come up with that has an Android device, you're gonna find they are not using an open source version of Android. They have their own layer on there. And I see this often, right? I'll see this all the time where people say, oh, why do you use an Android phone? Oh, I like that it's open source. And it's like, dude, no, the phone you're using has not a single ounce of open sourceness. Yes, the layer it's using underneath maybe, but the thing you really should be worried about is what's on top of Android. And again, I want to add, I'm not saying all open source is bad. There are absolutely necessities to having open source. Something like Linux makes sense, right? This is a good place to have open source But guess what's different about Linux? Notice here, when I go into the README of Linux, I'm not seeing open source spammed across the entire document. It's not even mentioning open source anywhere. And so this is an example of a project that's open source because it wants to be, not because it wants to benefit from just the fact of it being open source. And I think it's a sad day when this bar completely reaches the left side.